The plane hummed steadily in the sky, and Mia moved down the aisle of first class, gliding silently between the rows of luxurious seats as the lights above flickered in the dim cabin. She tried to push away the nervous feeling that always came when she was on long-haul flights, but today felt different. She couldn't put her finger on it. There was a sense of anticipation in the air that she couldn't explain. Her uniform pressed perfectly, and her smile wide and practiced. She greeted each passenger with the same polite enthusiasm that came naturally after years of working this job. But as she passed the first row, her eyes landed on an elderly woman sitting alone in the corner seat of first class, a seat that Mia knew was reserved for only the most important passengers. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. Something about the woman made Mia pause for a moment. She looked out of place in first class. The woman wore a simple dress, her silver hair neatly styled, but her face was sharp and calculating. There was something about her eyes. They didn't look like the eyes of an ordinary elderly woman. They were sharp, almost like a predator sizing up its prey. Maya forced a smile and moved toward the woman. She hadn't made eye contact with any of the other passengers. But now, as Mia approached, those piercing eyes locked onto hers. The elderly woman smiled slightly, a cool, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was watching her closely, studying her. Mia's heart skipped a beat for a moment. She felt like she was being sized up in a way she hadn't experienced before, but it passed quickly as Mia pushed the strange sensation away. Surely she was just overthinking it. She was trained to handle passengers of all kinds, including those who could be demanding or difficult. Her focus shifted back to her duties. The elderly woman was simply another first-class customer, Mia thought as she stood before her, asking how she could help. "Good evening, ma'am. What can I get for you?" Mia's voice was bright and polite. The woman didn't speak right away. She simply looked at Mia for a long time. Her gaze seemed to linger for longer than usual, making Mia uncomfortable. Then finally the woman spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. "I'll have the gluten-free meal, please, and I'd like my tea brewed at exactly 190 degrees. Her voice was soft, but there was an undeniable authority in it. Mia blinked, confused for a moment as she processed the request. It wasn't an ordinary one, but it wasn't unreasonable either. Still, the way the woman had spoken felt different from any request she'd received in a long time, as though the woman knew exactly what she wanted and expected it to be done. Mia nodded and smiled. "Of course, ma'am." But in her mind she couldn't help but roll her eyes just a little. The woman was demanding, but not in the way Mia had expected. She wasn't rude or impatient, but there was something unsettling about her cool composure. It was almost like she wasn't just a passenger. She was someone who had seen the world from a different perspective, and Mia found herself wondering what kind of life the woman had lived. Who was she to act so calmly in such a luxurious setting? Mia turned to leave, but the elderly woman's eyes followed her every movement. Maya felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She had a feeling she was being watched, and for some reason it bothered her more than it should have. As Mia moved away to fulfill the woman's order, she couldn't shake the thought that there was something important she had missed, that there was more to this woman than she let on. But she pushed the thought away and went about her duties with a forced focus. Still, the nagging feeling remained like a shadow hanging just out of reach. Her hands worked quickly as she prepared the meal and the tea, but her mind kept drifting back to the elderly woman and those sharp eyes watching her. It wasn't until Maya returned with the meal that she realized she was more anxious than she had been all day. This wasn't just any ordinary passenger, and Mia had a growing sense that this flight wasn't going to be like any other. Mia returned with the tea and meal in hand, the tray trembling slightly as she approached the woman's seat. The elderly woman looked up, her gaze never leaving Mia's eyes, as if she were studying her the way an artist studies their canvas. Mia felt her heart skip a beat and her breath catch for a moment. She almost wondered if the woman could see into her soul, or if it was all in her head. She set the tray down with a soft click of metal against the table. The woman's hands moved slowly to pick up the tea and sip it with perfect grace. Maya stood frozen for a moment, watching her, unsure of what to do next. She had never felt so out of place, serving a passenger before. The woman didn't say anything at first, just continued sipping her tea with the air of someone who had all the time in the world. but the silence between them grew thick with each passing second. Mia found herself feeling awkward, caught in the web of the woman's gaze, which never wavered from hers. "You seem a bit anxious, dear." The woman finally spoke, her voice soft and pleasant, but the words held an edge that Mia couldn't quite place. She blinked, taken aback by the comment. She hadn't said a word or even made a sound that would indicate anxiety had the woman noticed something in her body language. Mia tried to laugh it off. "Oh, I'm fine, ma'am, just doing my job," she said, but the words felt hollow to her own ears. The woman raised an eyebrow just slightly, her lips curling into a small knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked again, her tone casual, but it felt like a challenge, as if the woman was calling her out without saying a word. Mia nodded quickly, too quickly, hoping to brush off the strange conversation. "Yes, I'm sure." But as she turned to walk away, her eyes darted over the woman's shoulder toward the rest of the cabin. It felt like a different world than the one she was in now. The stillness of the first-class cabin seemed to hum with tension. There was something lurking just beneath the surface of normality, and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow at the center of it. She took a deep breath and forced herself to walk away. But she couldn't forget the woman's eyes, those eyes that seemed to follow her every move like they were measuring her every action. Mia didn't know why, but the more she tried to push the feeling away, the stronger it became. Something wasn't right with this flight. It was the way the passengers seemed quieter than usual, the way the crew worked a little faster, as if trying to avoid some unseen threat. And then there was the elderly woman who had requested her tea at exactly 190 degrees. As if it mattered so much, Mia couldn't help herself. She found herself returning to the galley and checking her phone, hoping to distract herself from the growing sense of dread. When she looked up again, the woman was gone. Mia frowned and walked back into the cabin, scanning the rows of seats. Where had she gone? She was still in first class, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Had she moved to the bathroom? Mia's stomach churned with a strange unease. Just as she turned to walk down the aisle again, she heard a voice from behind her. "You might want to check the business class section." The voice was calm, but there was something urgent behind it. Mia turned quickly, but no one was there. The voice had come from the back of the cabin. It sounded so clear, so direct, it almost felt like the woman's voice. But she hadn't seen her leave her seat. The hairs on the back of Mia's neck stood on end. A chill ran down her spine, and her hands began to shake just a little. She had no idea who had spoken or why, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. She moved toward the business class area, her steps quickening with each passing second, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. What was going on? Why did she feel like this? And why had the elderly woman made that strange remark? What was she trying to warn her about? Mia knew she had to get to the bottom of it, but her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the business class section, her instincts screaming that what she would find there would change everything. Mia's steps quickened as she moved toward the business class section. Her mind raced with thoughts. She couldn't quite make sense of the voice. It sounded so real, yet there was no one in sight. She glanced over her shoulder, but the first-class cabin was eerily quiet. Not a sound, not a single movement from the passengers she had been serving just moments ago. The whole atmosphere seemed to have shifted. It was as if a curtain had fallen, and the world around her had become strangely still. Even the hum of the plane seemed muted now. She reached the entrance to business class and hesitated for a moment. Her hand gripped the door handle, but she wasn't sure what she was looking for or what she expected to find. She opened the door slowly, stepping into the darkened business class area. The lights here were dimmer, the passengers mostly asleep or lost in their own worlds. The cabin felt colder, almost unsettlingly, so Mia stood at the threshold for a moment, scanning the rows of seats. No one seemed out of place, but her gut told her there was something she had missed, something hidden beneath the surface of the mundane. She took a deep breath and walked further into the cabin. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was pressing down on her. She passed row after row, but there was nothing unusual. The seats were filled with passengers, all peacefully resting or absorbed in their own activities. But as she neared the middle of the cabin, her eyes locked onto something out of place. It was a brief flash, but enough to make her stop dead in her tracks. A glimmer of movement in the corner of her eye near the emergency exit. The figure was small, hunched over, but it was gone almost as soon as Mia saw it. She blinked and looked back, but there was nothing there, no movement, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, and her palms began to sweat. A chill ran down her spine. What was she seeing? Was it her mind playing tricks on her, or was there something else happening here? Mia knew she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't just walk away. She had to figure out what was going on. She turned toward the galley area where the crew was gathering. She needed answers. She needed to know what the captain had meant by the message about a potential threat. She was about to make her way back when the voice from earlier echoed in her mind again, so clear, so distinct. It was as though the woman had spoken directly into her ear. "You might want to check the business class section." Maya froze. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't been hallucinating. The elderly woman had known something she hadn't, but how was that possible? How did she know what Mia hadn't even realized herself? The weight of the situation hit her like a freight train. Her hands trembled as she took another step further into the business class cabin, her breath shallow. She glanced quickly over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. Maya's stomach twisted with a knot of unease, and suddenly the quiet of the cabin felt oppressive. She wasn't alone here, she was sure of it. But who or what was lurking just out of sight? She continued her slow walk through the rows of seats, her heart pounding harder with each step. Her nerves were on edge. She had to find out what was happening. She had to uncover the mystery before it was too late. Just then, she heard a faint sound like a breath or a shuffle of movement. It was barely audible, but it was enough to stop her dead in her tracks. She turned sharply, looking in every direction, but again saw nothing out of the ordinary. She took a slow, deep breath to steady herself and began moving forward once more, but this time she was no longer walking with the casual confidence of a flight attendant. She was walking with a sense of urgency, her pulse racing with each step, the feeling that something was terribly wrong clinging to her like a shadow. She turned the corner to find the emergency exit, and then stopped suddenly, her eyes widening with shock. There on the floor was something that didn't belong, a small metallic object glittering faintly in the dim light. It looked like a key, but it was unlike any key she had ever seen before. It was heavy, solid in her hand, and when she picked it up, she felt a strange pulse of warmth travel up her arm, as if the key was somehow alive. Her fingers clenched around it instinctively, but as she held it, she realized she was no longer alone. The air shifted around her like a presence was closing, and her stomach churned, and for the first time since the flight began, she felt truly afraid. And in that moment, she knew that nothing about this flight was what it seemed. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there holding the strange key. It was warm in her palm, as if it had absorbed the energy of the cabin itself. She turned it over in her fingers, trying to make sense of it, but the more she examined it, the less she understood. What was it doing here? Who had left it? Why was it calling to her? She slipped it into her pocket quickly, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the air itself had thickened around her. Her thoughts were tangled. She had to get back to the galley. She had to talk to the captain. She needed to know what was going on. But just as she started to turn toward the aisle, a voice came from behind her, so quiet she almost didn't hear it at first, but it was unmistakable. "You found it, didn't you?" Mia froze. The voice was soft, but it carried an unsettling calm. She turned slowly, and her eyes locked onto the elderly woman who was now standing at the back of the cabin, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. How long had she been standing there watching? How had she moved so silently? Mia's throat tightened. She swallowed hard, but didn't answer. Instead, she just stared at the woman who was now inching closer to her. With every step she took, it was as though time had slowed down, and in that moment the plane around her seemed to vanish until there was only the woman and Mia alone in the stillness of the cabin. "I told you you might need it," the woman continued, her voice almost a whisper now. "I knew you would find it eventually." Mia's pulse quickened. She took a step back instinctively. Her mind screamed that she should run, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. She couldn't look away from the woman who had been so eerily calm throughout the flight, her hands clenched at her sides, as if ready to react. but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. "What do you want from me?" Mia finally asked, her voice shaking, but the woman just smiled faintly. "I'm not here for you," she said cryptically. "You're here for something else, something much bigger than this plane, much bigger than either of us." Mia's confusion grew, but she didn't have time to ask any more questions. The woman's eyes shifted suddenly to the rear of the cabin. Her face went from serene to alert in an instant. "They're coming," she muttered, barely audible, but the words struck Mia like a punch to the gut. She didn't know who or what the woman was talking about, but she knew something was happening, something that was far beyond the ordinary world she had known for so long. The sense of danger in the air was palpable. It was as if the very walls of the plane were closing in. Mia's breath quickened, her body frozen in place, as the woman's gaze snapped back to her with urgency. "You need to leave this cabin now," the woman said in a low voice, her tone serious. But there was no time to react, no time to process what was happening before the voice of the captain blared through the intercom, interrupting the tension. "All crew members report to the cockpit immediately." Mia's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in the captain's voice sent a chill through her. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening, it had just escalated to a new level. She looked back at the elderly woman, whose eyes were now wide with a strange intensity, her face unreadable, but there was something else in her expression: fear. Mia didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted toward the galley, her mind racing with the realization that everything she thought she knew about this flight had just been thrown into chaos. She reached the galley quickly, but as she stepped inside, she found that it wasn't the safe refuge she had imagined. The crew was already there. The door to the cockpit had been opened slightly, and Mia could see shadows moving inside. She wasn't sure what was happening, but the scene unfolding before her was anything but normal. She took a deep breath as she stepped closer to the door, and then the lights flickered for a split second, and in that moment, the cabin plunged into complete darkness. The darkness swallowed the cabin in an instant, and Mia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes strained to adjust to the pitch blackness. But there was no light, no hint of the world she had just been a part of. The hum of the plane disappeared. It was as if the entire aircraft had fallen into some kind of suspended silence. Her heartbeat was the only sound she could hear echoing in her ears. Her hands fumbled in front of her as she tried to find her bearings, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. She needed to find the light switch. She needed to figure out what was happening. But every step she took felt like she was moving deeper into the unknown. She stretched out her hand cautiously and felt her fingers brush against something cold. It was metal and sharp. She gasped, stumbling backward, her heart pounding harder now. As her hand touched the edge of a seat, it felt wrong, as if the plane itself had shifted in some way. The structure felt unfamiliar. Mia took another step, trying to steady her breath. But just as she moved, a faint sound cut through the darkness. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She froze. The footsteps were coming closer, not from the front, but from the back. They were too steady, too purposeful for anyone who might have been caught off guard in the dark. Mia's stomach twisted with dread, and her feet instinctively moved backward. She felt her body tense as the footsteps continued growing nearer. She couldn't see who it was, but she could feel their presence closing in. She had no idea how many people were moving toward her or who they were, but her instincts screamed at her to run. She reached into her pocket, feeling for the key. She had found it was still there, warm against her skin, like it was calling to her, like it knew something she didn't. The footsteps were almost upon her, and she had no choice but to move. She turned quickly and dashed toward the galley, her mind wild with fear. She had no idea who was chasing her or why, but she knew she couldn't stay in the dark like this. She had to find the crew. She had to figure out what was going on. The door to the galley slammed open as she entered, but it was empty. No one was there. The crew members had vanished. Mia's breathing came in ragged gasps. She was alone. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. The silence was suffocating. She didn't have time to wonder what was happening. The panic rising in her chest was too much to ignore. She stumbled toward the cockpit door, pulling at the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. She tried again and again, her heart racing faster with each failed attempt. She had to get in there. She had to see what was happening inside. She could feel the pressure building inside her as the darkness closed in around her. Suddenly, A voice cut through the air so close to her ear, it made her jump. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low and smooth like velvet, but it held an unmistakable threat. Mia whipped around her heart, almost stopping when she saw the figure standing in the doorway. The elderly woman stood there, her presence chilling in the dim light, her face unreadable, her eyes cold and calculating. "What do you want from me?" Mia gasped, her voice trembling. The woman took a slow step forward, her gaze fixed on Mia with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I told you," the woman's voice was almost a whisper now. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Mia's hand shook, but she didn't back away. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing was certain: the woman wasn't just some ordinary passenger. She wasn't even an ordinary person. She was something else, something powerful. Mia swallowed hard. "What are you?" she whispered, but the woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her face inches from Mia's. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly, her breath warm against Mia's face. And then she reached out a hand and touched Mia's arm. Her fingers were cold like ice, and for a moment Mia felt a strange sensation ripple through her body, as if her very soul was being touched. She tried to pull away, but the woman's grip was firm, too firm. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her mind was spinning, her body frozen in place, as if something beyond her control had taken over. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment Mia knew she was no longer just a passenger on this flight. She was part of something much darker, something much more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. Mia's mind raced, her body frozen under the woman's cold touch. Her breath was shallow, every nerve in her body screamed for her to break free. But the woman's grip held firm, her fingers dug into Mia's arm like icy claws, her pulse hammered in her ears. As she struggled to move, she tried to scream, but no sound left her lips. It was as if her voice had been stolen from her. The woman's eyes never left hers. They were cold and calculating, filled with a knowing darkness that sent chills down Mia's spine. She couldn't understand what was happening. She had never felt this kind of fear before, a fear that wasn't just in her body, but seemed to have sunk into her very soul. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, as if she could see every shred of terror that coursed through Mia. "You still don't understand, do you?" The woman's voice was a whisper now, soft but piercing like a knife slicing through the silence. "This flight is nothing like you think. It is nothing like you've been told." Mia's heart raced faster as the woman's grip tightened. She could feel the cold spreading through her arm, as if it was leaching into her very bones. She wanted to pull away, but the more she fought, the stronger the grip became. The woman leaned in closer, her breath against Mia's ear, sending a shiver through her. "You've been a part of this from the moment you stepped on board," she said, each word dripping with a dark promise. "You're not just a flight attendant, you're a piece of this game, just like everyone else on this plane." Mia's mind spun. She couldn't make sense of what the woman was saying. It felt as though the walls of reality were crumbling around her. The woman took a step back, and Mia stumbled backward, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. She was gasping for breath. Her head was spinning. She had to find answers. She couldn't just stand here trapped in this nightmare. But before she could move, the lights above flickered again, plunging the cabin into total darkness. This time, it wasn't just the lights. It felt as if the entire plane had shifted again. Mia's stomach dropped as the unmistakable sound of a door opening echoed through the cabin. But it wasn't the cockpit door, it was the emergency exit door. The low hiss of pressure escaping filled the air, followed by the faintest sounds of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Mia's eyes searched frantically through the darkness, but all she could hear were those footsteps growing closer and closer. They were coming from somewhere behind her, and they weren't slowing down. The cold sensation in her arm hadn't gone away. It had only spread. It was as though it had begun to seep into her entire body. Her skin felt tight and heavy, as if it no longer belonged to her. She tried to move forward, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her body felt like it was made of lead. She could barely breathe. As the footsteps neared, she could hear the soft scrape of shoes on the floor. The air was thick with tension. Every step felt like it was echoing through her soul. Then a voice broke the silence, a voice Mia knew all too well. It was the captain's voice, but it was different. It was lower somehow, as if it had been altered. "Mia, you need to stay calm." The voice was calm, but it held an unmistakable edge of urgency. "Get to the cockpit now." But Mia couldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to listen, but her body was trapped, her feet glued to the floor. The woman's eyes were on her again, unblinking, almost like a predator watching its prey. Mia tried again to move, but this time she felt something worse than the cold, something sharper. It was like a presence closing in behind her, a dark figure looming out of the shadows. She turned to face it, but saw nothing. The footsteps were still growing louder, but the figure itself remained hidden just out of her line of sight. She forced herself to take a step forward, but every muscle in her body felt sluggish, heavy. It was as if the air itself was pushing back against her, as if she were fighting against some unseen force. The cold sensation in her arm had spread further, now reaching her chest. She felt her breath constricting. She had to get to the cockpit. She had to get to the only place that might offer any safety. But as she took another step, she heard the voice again. The captain's voice, only this time. It was clearer, more direct. "Mia, you have to trust me. We are not alone on this plane." The words hit her like a thunderclap. Everything inside her froze. The feeling of the unseen figure behind her grew stronger. Mia's heart slammed in her chest. She couldn't take another step forward. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides. Her body felt like it was suffocating under the weight of everything. She couldn't see. She was trapped somewhere between the shadows and the cold. The footsteps were nearly upon her now. Mia's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. But there was only one thing she knew for sure. She had to survive. She had to escape this nightmare somehow. The darkness around Mia seemed to close in tighter. With every passing second, her breath was shallow, her chest tight, as she tried to make sense of the captain's warning. She could feel the cold spreading further now. Every inch of her body seemed to be growing numb. It was as if something had taken hold of her, and she couldn't break free. The footsteps behind her were almost upon her, but she refused to turn around. She couldn't afford to face whatever it was that lurked in the shadows. She had to keep moving, even though her legs felt like they were made of stone. She took a shaky step forward, but her body wouldn't obey. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet remained planted in place. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. The air was thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. Just then, the footsteps stopped and all was silent for a long moment, too long a silence that stretched out like an eternity. Mia's mind raced. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her entire body rigid as she strained to listen for any sound. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence behind her hadn't gone away. It was still there, watching, waiting. She felt it like an icy hand pressing against her spine. She felt it more than saw it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her breath hitched as she waited for whatever was coming next. Then the voice came again. Only this time it was different. It wasn't the captain's voice. It wasn't the elderly woman's voice. It was a deep, rasping voice, one that sounded like it was coming from the very depths of the darkness itself. "You're not alone, Mia." The voice hissed, its tone low and menacing. The words sent a shock of fear through her entire body. The presence behind her grew stronger with every syllable, like something was moving just out of sight, something that was far too large to be human. She tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in her throat, her mouth dry as dust. She couldn't make a sound, no matter how hard she tried. Then the footsteps began again. This time they were faster, more frantic, as if whatever was stalking her had grown impatient and was closing in. Mia's heart raced. She didn't have much time. Whatever was behind her was coming closer, and she knew that if she didn't move now, it would be too late. Her legs were like jelly, but somehow she forced herself to turn and start running. She bolted down the aisle toward the cockpit. Her steps were clumsy, her feet tripping over one another, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let whatever was after her catch her. She pushed herself harder. The lights flickered again, and the shadows seemed to move with her. They swirled around her like living things, wrapping themselves around her legs, pulling her back. She stumbled but kept running, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, like it was trying to consume her. She didn't know where she was anymore. Everything had turned into a blur of black and gray. The walls, the seats, the floor, all had disappeared into the void. It felt like she was running through nothingness, like she was lost in a nightmare that had no end. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, closer, faster. She could hear the rasping voice again, this time so close it was like it was whispering right in her ear. "You can't escape. It growled. Mia's chest tightened as panic surged through her veins. She had to keep moving, she had to reach the cockpit, but the hallway ahead of her seemed to stretch on forever, and the further she ran the more she felt the darkness closing in on her. She could almost feel it crawling over her skin, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, until she thought she might collapse under it. Then, in the distance, she saw a flicker of light. The cockpit door was ahead. She could see the faintest glow coming from the crack beneath it. She was so close to safety. But just as she reached out for the door handle, a cold hand shot out of the darkness and grabbed her wrist. It was like ice burning against her skin. Mia screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the shadows. She twisted and struggled, but the grip was too strong. It yanked her back into the darkness, pulling her away from the door. Her mind screamed in terror. As she was dragged backward, she had no control, no way to escape the force that was dragging her away from safety. The footsteps grew louder and louder now, all around her, like 1,000 shadows closing in at once. The darkness seemed to rise up and swallow her whole, and for a moment, Maya thought she had lost everything. But then something unexpected happened. The grip on her wrist loosened just enough for her to break free. In one desperate move, she tore herself away and sprinted toward the door, her body screaming in protest as she pushed herself harder than ever before. But the darkness was still there. It was never far behind. As she reached the cockpit door, she shoved it open with all her strength and rushed inside. The door slammed shut behind Mia. With a deafening thud, the cockpit was bathed in an eerie blue glow. The captain sat at the controls, his face tense, his eyes darting to her. As she stumbled into the room, his hands gripping the flight yoke as if he was ready to fight the air itself. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her as she collapsed against the door, gasping for air, her mind still reeling from the darkness that had chased her from the cabin. The shadows that had almost consumed her, the presence behind her, was gone, but the cold had not left her. She could still feel it like a lingering ghost crawling under her skin. She shuddered as she tried to steady her breath. The captain didn't move. Instead, he kept his eyes on her, almost as if he was waiting for her to say something. She couldn't speak. The words weren't there. Her mind was a jumbled mess. But then the captain broke the silence, his voice low but urgent. "You shouldn't have come in here." His words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken weight. Mia's eyes flicked toward the cockpit windows, but all she saw was the vast emptiness of the night sky. The stars were so far away, they looked like tiny pinpricks of light in an infinite void. She felt so small, so insignificant, as if she didn't belong here. But the captain's words sent a chill through her body. She turned to him slowly, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her throat dry. "You're not supposed to know any of this," he said, his tone darker than before. "The flight you're on, it's not just any ordinary flight." Mia's stomach twisted with a mixture of dread and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Why is this happening?" The captain hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with something that Mia couldn't read. Then he spoke again, his voice almost inaudible. "We're not alone," he said simply, "not just on the plane, but in the skies too." Mia's mind went blank for a moment, as if the words didn't quite register. She couldn't understand what he was saying. "What do you mean?" she asked again. But the captain didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and turned the controls slightly, his hand steady, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. But there was something in his eyes now, something dark, something Mia had never seen before. She felt the weight of his gaze settle on her, and she knew whatever was happening, whatever was lurking beyond the walls of the plane, it was far worse than she could have imagined. "We're being followed," the captain said, suddenly, his voice cracking just slightly. "There's something up there with us, something watching us." Mia's pulse spiked, the fear in his voice, so raw, so real that it sent a wave of terror through her. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The captain continued speaking, his hands still gripping the yoke with white knuckles. "I didn't want to believe it either, but it's real," he said, his eyes darting nervously toward the windows. "They're coming closer now. We don't have much time." Maya felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead, her mind spinning. She didn't know what he meant. She didn't know what was chasing them. But the panic in his voice made it clear that this was not a normal flight. She took a shaky step forward. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We can't outrun them," the captain replied, his eyes wide with fear. "But we can try to survive." He turned back to the controls and began adjusting the instruments furiously, his movements quick but precise. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. As she watched him, the tension in the cockpit was thick enough to cut with a knife. She had no idea what was going on, but one thing was certain: something was out there in the night, watching, waiting, and closing in on them. She tried to steady her breath, but it felt like the walls of the plane were closing in on her too. The air was thick with anticipation and fear, and just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered again. And this time they didn't just flicker, they went out entirely. The cockpit was plunged into total darkness. The engine seemed to stutter and then stopped altogether. The silence was deafening. As if the world outside had ceased to exist, Mia could hear the captain's breath quicken, his hands gripping the controls with desperation. But there was nothing he could do. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but an endless void of darkness. And then from the corner of her eye, Mia saw a flash of movement in the dark just outside the window. Something large, something moving fast, too close. She froze, her blood turning to ice as the shape grew larger and larger until it was right on top of them.